Altogether Ooky is brought to you by Microsoft Edge, the browser you use when you can't figure out how to use a good browser. This is Altogether Ooky, a show produced by SATV in Salem, Massachusetts. I am your host, Clovis Black. That's not my real name, but there's a published author who lives in Salem and has almost the exact same name that I do, so just call me Clovis. Altogether Ooky is dedicated to all things mysterious and spooky, especially when they have to do with Salem. I'd like to teach you how to make scary noises. The secret is to actually inhale. Here's a demonstration. Keep in mind this does a number on your throat. During the Halloween season, I bark for a haunted house, and I have to pace myself to make sure I don't lose my voice. As you can imagine, when you bark, your voice is a precious and limited resource. I mostly stick to low-pitched growls. Using a high pitch is significantly more taxing on your vocal cords. I found that these noises are fun to make when you're handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. As soon as they ring the doorbell, moan and screech. Then open the door and act completely normal as you give out the candy. Of course, if they ask you what the noise was, just act like you don't know what they were talking about. This is good spooky fun that doesn't scare the kids too much. The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft, read by Clovis Black. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers, with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet I am strangely content, and cling desperately to those sere memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partially ruined and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strode some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings which I found in many of the moldy books. From such books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own, for although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to those youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went farther from the castle the shade grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then in the shadowy solitude my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky. And at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, and deserted, and sinister with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for, climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill as of haunted and venerable mold assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure, that I might peer out and above and try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew that I must have gained the roof or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended, since the slab was the trapdoor of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower. No doubt the floor is some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, but hoped when necessary to pry it open again. Believing now I was at a prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows that I might look for the first time upon the sky and the moon and stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected, and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment so many eons cut off from the castle below. Then, unexpectedly, my hands came upon a doorway, where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known. For shining tranquilly through the ornate grating of iron, and down a short stone passageway of steps that descended from the newly found doorway, was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams, and in vague visions I dared not call memories. Fancying now that I had obtained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror to what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from a lofty eminence, There stretched around me on a level through the grating nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was or what my surroundings might be, though as I continued to stumble along I became conscious of a kind of fearsome latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch out of that region of slabs and columns, and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread upon meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollection. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I had ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic, several fell into a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved toward one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway leading to another and somewhat similar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly, and then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation, the putrid, dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world, yet to my horror I saw it in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines, a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape, and in its moldy, disintegrating apparel, an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much to make a feeble effort toward flight. A backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred, and shewed the most horrible object, but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the light, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close. When in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting, outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that I had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle and the trees, and recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering above me, as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos there's balm as well as bitterness, and that balm is Nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream, I fled from that haunted and accursed pile, and ran swiftly and silently into the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the stone trapdoor immovable. But I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle in the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nefren-Ka in the sealed and unknown valley of Harath by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety save the unnamed feast of Nitocris beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although Nepenthe has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century, and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass. That story was written by Howard Phillips Lovecraft, who lived from 1890 to 1937. Lovecraft had some moderate success as a writer while he was alive. Horror fans only truly recognized the man's genius after he died. Some of Lovecraft's stories are set in a fictional town in Massachusetts called Arkham. He based Arkham on the real town of Salem. If the name Arkham sounds familiar, it's because there's a reference to it in Batman. Batman's enemies get locked up in Arkham Asylum. In the story The Shadow over Innsmouth, Lovecraft wrote about a town inhabited by people who interbred with fish-like monsters. According to the story, the monster-human hybrids have a distinctive look, the Innsmouth look. They are described as having queer, narrow heads and bulgy, starry eyes. It's pretty clear that he made the people from Innsmouth look like him. A friend of mine talked with someone who actually knew Lovecraft. According to him, the author was every bit as racist as the stories make him seem. One of the things I love about living in Salem is all the history. For example, I often walk by the Gardner Pingree House. In 1830, Captain Joseph White was murdered there. This crime inspired the Parker Brothers board game Clue. When you think about it, Clue is pretty morbid for a children's game. Can you imagine killing someone with a candlestick? The first blow wouldn't even knock them out, so you'd have to go on hammering and hammering at them while they were still conscious. It has come to my attention that many members of the Jewish community have no idea that their ancestors came up with one of the best monsters of all time, the golem. This is mishigas and needs to be corrected. According to ancient Hebrew legends, a golem is a rough humanoid that is made of enchanted, lifeless matter such as clay. Sometimes golems are intelligent, and sometimes they are mindless automatons. Without exception, they are totally badass. The golem has been adopted into popular culture. You can find variations of the creature in Dungeons & Dragons, Pokemon, World of Warcraft, and other sources. My favorite golem of all time is Dorfel from the Discworld series, written by Sir Terry Pratchett. Discworld golems are self-aware, and Dorfel is completely sapient because he was set free. He's an atheist, and every time he says that the gods don't exist, he gets struck by lightning. Since he's made of baked clay, this doesn't harm him at all, and he states that he doesn't consider bolts of lightning to be valid arguments. I miss Sir Terry so much. Horace the Hook, adapted by Clovis Black from a Scottish folktale, read by Clovis Black. Once, during a time of terrible famine, there was a notorious highwayman named Horace Christie. He was better known as Horace the Hook because he and his men would pull travelers from their horses with hooks on poles. Since you can't eat money, the outlaws would then kill, cook, and eat their victims. Times eventually got more prosperous, and Horace the Hook became nothing more than a boogeyman. Mothers warned their children to stay away from a river with a deadly undertow, saying that Horace lived close to it. The children themselves would whisper his name to each other, then squeal in delighted fear. There was one house in which Horace the Hook was never mentioned. The father there was a pious man who insisted that to use the name of the outlaw for warnings or amusement was to disrespect all of the people he had killed. The man's wife and 2 daughters complied willingly, since he was kind and loving. In fact, everyone in the village in which he lived was fond of him. He generously shared his great wealth with the less fortunate, and always saw the best in everyone. When the man took ill in his old age, he gathered his wife and daughters around his bed. "For a long time I have wanted to tell you something, my dears. I have a brother, and his name is Ian. He lives in a village not too far from here. When I am gone, I would like you to go meet him." The 3 women were shocked. "Why are you only telling us of this now?" asked the wife. "Our daughters might have grown up knowing their uncle." The old man grimaced, more from emotional pain than the physical sort. "Before I met you, I changed my name. Our real family name is Christie." That did explain much. The last name of Christie was a burden that was nearly unbearable. The younger daughter spoke up. "Father, please assure us that your brother is not, you know, the man whose name we are not allowed to say." The father shook his head. "He is not my brother. Your uncle was born with the name Ian Christie and still has it to this day. He was too stubborn to change it." The old woman wanted to believe the man she loved, but doubts nagged at her. The day after the discussion, she went to the local church and looked in the book in which records of birth were kept. She saw that her husband had 2 brothers, Ian and Horace. That night, the 3 women again went to the man's sickbed. "Please be honest, for we must know," said the wife while tears rolled down her cheeks. "I have been to the church and know the names of your brothers. We will not hold you responsible for what your relative did. Is Horace the Hook your brother?" The man shook his head violently, as if trying to wake from a nightmare. No, I swear to you. I do have a brother who ran away when we were both children, and his name is Horace Christie. He is not, however, the murderous highwayman." The older daughter asked, "Father, if you haven't seen your brother since you were a child, how do you know he did not grow up to become Horace the Hook?" Again the man shook his head. "I know it for a fact, my loves, but please do not make me tell you how." The wife said, Tell us, how can you be so sure? Because I am Horace the Hook. Submit to me. Do you have what it takes to be altogether ooky? Maybe you run a spooky business in Salem. Maybe you wrote a horror story. Maybe you made a really cool Halloween costume. Maybe you watch a lot of horror movies and want to talk about them. Let us know, and you might be on the show. It's the end of the show, so I guess I should say a catchphrase. I can't think of any new catchphrases, so I'll just plagiarize someone else's. Snooch to the nooch!